Man, it is always something with this lady. It is always something, even in a blowout. I mean, this lady just can't get right. Yeah, just can't get right. Stephanie White absolutely blew up on the bench, crash out right in front of Caitlin Clark again. And for whatever reason, this only seems to happen.
Something snapped inside the Indiana Fever organization on that night, and the entire sports world felt it. Not a gradual unraveling, not a slow burn that gave anyone time to prepare. A full, catastrophic detonation that played out in real time in front of millions of viewers, with no warning and no way to contain the damage once it started. What began as a regular season matchup against the Las Vegas Aces turned into one of the most talked about moments in WNBA history, not because of what happened on the court, but because of what happened on the bench. And once the cameras caught it, there was no walking it back. For months, insiders had whispered about dysfunction inside the Indiana Fever organization. Players, reporters, and fans had all sensed that something was deeply wrong beneath the surface of this franchise. But professional sports organizations are extraordinarily good at keeping their internal chaos invisible to the public. Press conferences are managed, statements are carefully worded, coaches give rehearsed answers about team unity while everything behind closed doors is quietly falling apart. The Indiana Fever had mastered this performance right up until the moment they couldn't anymore. And when the mask finally came off, it didn't just fall, it shattered. What you're about to read is the complete breakdown of how one franchise's internal war against its own biggest star created a chain reaction that nobody in professional sports was ready for. Every detail, every confrontation, every moment that led from a single sideline outburst to a league-wide reckoning that people are still talking about today. To understand why that bench moment was so explosive, you first have to understand exactly who Caitlin Clark is to the WNBA, and why that reality made certain people inside the league deeply uncomfortable. Because Clark didn't just enter the league as a talented rookie, she arrived as a full economic earthquake, reshaping the financial landscape of women's professional basketball in ways that hadn't been seen in decades. Before Clark stepped onto a WNBA court, the league existed in a strange limbo. Talented players, passionate fans, genuine athletic excellence, but chronically limited visibility and a financial model that kept even the best players earning a fraction of what their male counterparts made. Road trips meant commercial flights, arenas were sometimes half empty, television deals were modest, the business model worked, but just barely, and growth had been slow and incremental for years. Then Clark showed up, and every single one of those numbers changed almost immediately. Sellout crowds became the new normal, television ratings spiked in ways that made network executives do double takes. Sponsorship interests surged, the conversation around women's basketball shifted from niche to mainstream almost overnight. Players who had been grinding for years in relative obscurity suddenly found themselves on private team flights, signing contracts with numbers they hadn't imagined possible just a season earlier. The money that Clark generated wasn't trickling down, it was flooding the entire ecosystem. Every player on every roster felt the financial impact of her presence in the league. And yet, from certain corners of the Indiana organization, the response to all of this wasn't gratitude. It wasn't strategic thinking about how to maximize what they had. It was something far more destructive and far more personal. The kind of reaction that only makes sense when professional jealousy completely overrides professional judgment. The coaching staff had inherited the most valuable player in women's basketball history, and instead of building around her, they seemed determined to cut her down to size. The warning signs had been there long before the Aces game. People who paid close attention to Fever games noticed patterns that didn't add up, rotations that seemed designed to limit Clark's impact rather than maximize it, substitution decisions that raised eyebrows, a general sense that the star of the show was being managed in a way that felt less like coaching and more like containment. Fans noticed, analysts noticed, the sports media noticed, but the franchise kept its public face locked tight, and Stephanie White kept giving the kind of measured, professional answers that made it difficult to point to a single moment and say definitively, "There it is, that's the problem." What makes dysfunction in a sports organization so insidious is that it rarely announces itself clearly. It lives in the spaces between plays, in the body language on the bench, in the look exchanged between a player and a coach that the camera catches for a half second before cutting away. Clark is the kind of player whose emotional state is readable. She wears her investment in the game openly, which is part of what makes her so compelling to watch. And those who watched closely could see, game after game, that something about the environment she was operating in was wearing on her in ways that pure basketball competition shouldn't.
And is this thing beyond repair at this point? This thing could just be beyond repair. And some people just feel like, hey man, this thing is over. I mean, it just is what it is. I don't really see things getting better or changing with Stephanie White. And I don't know. But Skip Bayless took to his YouTube and he wanted to.
The locker room dynamic was described by multiple observers as increasingly tense. Not the productive tension of a team pushing each other to be better, but the kind of quiet, low-level hostility that poisons a group from the inside. Clark had been trained her entire career to compete at the absolute highest level, to demand excellence from herself and the people around her. When the structure she was operating in seemed more interested in managing her influence than developing her game, the friction was inevitable. The only real question was when it would finally break into the open. That question got answered on the night the Aces came to town. The third quarter was when it happened. The Las Vegas Aces had found their rhythm, mounting a run that put serious pressure on the Fever's game plan. Clark had a turnover, one of those moments that happen to every player in the flow of a competitive game, a split-second mistake that carries no particular weight in isolation. But nothing about what came next was isolated. Nothing about it was proportionate, and nothing about it looked like coaching. The cameras caught Stephanie White on the sideline, and what they captured was not a coach delivering a tactical correction. It wasn't the kind of intense but professional exchange that happens between coaches and players at the highest level of competition. What the footage showed was an eruption, visible, uncontrolled, directed squarely at Clark in a way that bypassed every professional norm. Clark was on the bench, Gatorade bottle in hand, and you could see the moment White lost whatever composure she'd been holding on to. The reaction from viewers was immediate and overwhelming. People watching at home recognized what they were seeing. Sports commentators who had been measured and careful in their previous assessments of the Fever's internal situation dropped the diplomatic language entirely. Social media didn't wait for confirmation or context. The clip spread within minutes, and the collective reaction was one of genuine shock. Not because sideline intensity is unusual in professional sports, but because what this looked like was something different, something targeted, something personal. The comments from fans ranged from disbelief to outright fury, and the volume of that reaction made it impossible for the organization to pretend the moment hadn't happened the way it happened. Story here seems to be Stephanie White blowing up at Caitlin Clark on the bench here once again, one commentator noted, barely concealing the disbelief in his voice. Oh yeah, she's snapping, she's pissed. The phrase "once again" did a lot of work in that sentence. It confirmed what many had suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern that had finally become impossible to ignore. Here's the part of the story that turns the volume up even further, because you cannot fully absorb the significance of this moment without understanding the scale of what Clark brought to this league. And the people closest to the situation weren't shy about saying it plainly. The commentary from analysts in the immediate aftermath of the bench incident kept returning to the same theme, stated with increasing bluntness as the night went on. This was the person who transformed the economic reality of every player in the WNBA. Before Clark, players were sharing commercial flights on road trips. After Clark, entire rosters were traveling on private team planes. Before Clark, playing in front of a packed arena was an exceptional circumstance. After Clark, sellout crowds became the expected baseline. Before Clark, million-dollar contracts for WNBA players were vanishingly rare. After Clark, the conversation around player compensation shifted fundamentally. She turned this whole thing up, as one analyst put it, with visible emotion. Now everybody is eating. Everybody is eating because of Caitlin. The bluntness of that statement reflects a frustration that had been building for some time among people who felt the league's response to Clark's impact had been inadequate at best and actively hostile at worst. When the person generating the most revenue in your organization's history is being screamed at on the bench during a nationally televised game, the moral and financial math becomes very simple. And that math was being calculated by people far above the coaching staff level.
The financial transformation wasn't subtle or gradual. It was the kind of overnight shift that changes how an entire organization operates. What had been incremental year-over-year growth in the WNBA became something exponential the moment Clark arrived. Sponsors who had been cautiously interested became aggressively committed. Television deals that might have taken years to negotiate accelerated. The league's profile in mainstream sports media, which had always been a constant battle to maintain, suddenly required no battle at all. Clark was generating attention that the WNBA hadn't been able to buy at any price. And from somewhere inside the Indiana organization, the response to all of this was a screaming confrontation on a nationally broadcast sideline. When something like this happens in professional sports, there's usually a process. Investigations are announced, statements are released, independent reviews are commissioned, committees are formed. The machinery of institutional response grinds forward at its own pace, carefully managed to project an image of control while the actual decision-making happens slowly and privately behind closed doors. What's almost never supposed to happen is immediate, visible, public accountability in real time. Institutions don't move that fast. They're specifically designed not to. But the pressure that had been building around the Fever's treatment of Clark had reached a level where the standard institutional response wasn't going to be sufficient. Commentators who covered the league had been growing more vocal. Fan reaction to the clip of the bench incident was reaching a volume that made it impossible to manage with a carefully worded press release. Sponsors who had attached themselves to the Clark phenomenon were paying close attention to how the organization handled the fallout. And everyone with a financial stake in the WNBA's continued growth understood that the league's credibility was directly tied to how it responded to this moment. This thing could just be beyond repair, one analyst said, giving voice to what a lot of people in the league's orbit were privately thinking. I don't really see things getting better or changing. That kind of public assessment, coming from credible voices with genuine knowledge of the situation, made the pressure on league leadership impossible to ignore. When respected analysts are going on record saying the situation is unsalvageable, the window for a measured, gradual response closes fast. The question wasn't whether something would change, the question was how dramatic that change would have to be to actually mean something. The answer, when it came, was more dramatic than most people expected, and it sent a message that was felt well beyond Indianapolis. After everything that had played out publicly, the footage, the commentary, the social media firestorm, the analyst assessments, what everyone was waiting for was Clark herself, because she hadn't said much. She'd been measured, careful, almost deliberately quiet while the noise around her situation reached deafening levels. That restraint, if anything, made the anticipation of her eventual response even more intense. What would she actually say when she finally decided to say it? What she delivered was more layered and more emotionally honest than a simple public accusation. Standing in front of reporters, Clark spoke with the kind of exhausted clarity that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. She acknowledged that the situation affected her more than she typically let on publicly. She talked about turning on the television days after a game and still seeing the same conversations dominating coverage. And then she said something that reframed the entire situation in a way that caught a lot of people off guard. "I feel like that's just a real disservice to our league," she said, her voice carrying a weight that went beyond frustration. To continue to be down and then for the narrative to be taken to other places, that's just not acceptable. She wasn't just talking about her own experience, she was talking about the broader damage being done to women's basketball by the constant negative cycle around her situation. The talent in the league, the quality of play, the other athletes who deserved recognition, all of it was being buried under the weight of a controversy that didn't need to exist. That reframing was significant. Clark didn't position herself as a victim demanding sympathy. She positioned herself as someone who cared about the league and was watching the dysfunction around her hurt something she had invested herself in building. "It's a disservice to my team, but it's also a disservice to the other teams in this league and the other players in this league. There's so much amazing talent." The message was clear. This wasn't just about her. The cost of this dysfunction was being paid by everyone in women's basketball, and she was done pretending otherwise. Clark's willingness to speak openly about the situation broke something loose in the broader conversation around women's basketball, and that conversation went to places that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Because the story of Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a much larger, much more complicated debate about legacy, identity, and who gets credit for building something.
On one side of that debate are people who look at the transformation in the WNBA's financial profile and trace it directly to Clark's arrival, arguing that her impact has been so immediate and so measurable that it represents something genuinely unprecedented. On the other side are those who feel that framing erases the decades of work that players like Cynthia Cooper, Cheryl Swoops, Lisa Leslie, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, Maya Moore, and Aja Wilson put into making the league viable in the first place. Both of these things can contain truth simultaneously, and yet the debate has been conducted mostly at maximum volume with minimum nuance. The WNBA was built on the backs of many people who came before Caitlin Clark, one commentator stated firmly, pushing back against narratives that seemed to dismiss the league's history before her arrival. The counter-argument came equally fast, that what Clark specifically brought wasn't just talent, it was a level of mainstream commercial visibility that had eluded even the greatest players in WNBA history. "What did they make it other than a business that wasn't profitable?" came the sharp response, cutting to the economic reality with a bluntness that some found clarifying and others found offensive. What's interesting about this debate is that it didn't stay neatly inside the boundaries of basketball analysis. It became a mirror for larger conversations about race, visibility, and whose contributions get recognized and whose get minimized. The people arguing most passionately on each side weren't really arguing just about basketball anymore. They were arguing about something deeper, about fairness, about history, about what it means when one person's arrival changes the financial trajectory of an institution that other people spent their careers building. That's not a debate that gets resolved in a single news cycle. It's the kind of argument that reveals fault lines that were already there, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure to make them visible. While the public debate raged across social media and sports media, a quieter but potentially more consequential reckoning was happening in boardrooms and marketing departments, because the sponsors who had invested in the recent growth of the WNBA, the companies who had tied their brands to the league's expanded visibility and its association with Clark specifically, were watching everything unfold with the cold, unsentimental calculation that defines corporate decision-making. Brand association is everything in modern sports marketing. Companies don't just sponsor leagues or teams, they sponsor the narrative those teams project. The narrative that had made WNBA sponsorship newly attractive was one of explosive growth, exciting young talent, and a league finally reaching its potential. The narrative that was now dominating coverage was dysfunction, internal hostility, a coaching staff seemingly at war with its own star player, and organizational leadership that appeared incapable of managing the moment it was in. Those are not equivalent narratives from a brand perspective. One is an opportunity, the other is a liability. The math for sponsors was straightforward, even if the decision was uncomfortable. Continued association with a franchise in visible crisis, with footage circulating of a coach screaming at the player those sponsors had largely come to see, was a reputational risk that no amount of existing commitment could justify indefinitely. When marketing budgets get reconsidered and brand partnerships get quietly paused, organizations feel it immediately and viscerally in ways that no press release or public statement can fully cushion. The financial consequences of mismanaging this situation weren't theoretical. They were arriving in real time, and every executive connected to the Indiana franchise understood exactly what was happening and why. For players across the WNBA watching this play out, the lesson was stark and somewhat hopeful at the same time. The leverage that Clark's economic impact had created wasn't just her leverage. It was evidence that when women's basketball generates real revenue, real accountability becomes possible in ways it wasn't before. The financial stakes had become high enough that sponsors, league leadership, and the media could no longer look away from treatment of players that would have been quietly absorbed and forgotten in a different era. The money changed the equation, and Clark, almost incidentally, had generated more of that money than anyone in the league's history. Step back from the immediate drama of the bench incident, the public response, and the cascade of consequences that followed, and something bigger comes into focus. Because what happened here wasn't just a bad night for one franchise. It was a stress test of the entire system of accountability that governs professional women's sports. And the results of that stress test revealed things that are genuinely important for anyone who cares about where women's athletics is headed.
For years, the standard operating assumption in professional sports was that the institution protected its own. Coaches were management, players were labor, and when conflicts arose between the two, the institution's instinct was almost always to absorb the conflict quietly, protect the authority of management, and present a unified face to the public while handling things internally. That model works when the stakes are low enough that no single player's experience generates significant public attention. Clark shattered that model simply by being who she is, someone whose every interaction with the organization was being watched by millions of people who cared deeply about what they were seeing. The commentators who pointed out that the league had essentially been carried to a new level of relevance by one player were making a point that went beyond simple gratitude or credit. They were identifying a shift in power dynamics that changes the calculus for how organizations can behave. When a player's value to an institution is measured not just in wins and losses, but in television ratings, sponsorship revenue, arena attendance, and league-wide financial transformation, the institution's relationship with that player is fundamentally different than it used to be. Treating that player in ways that are publicly visible and publicly indefensible carries consequences that institutions used to be able to avoid. Not anymore. The conversation around athlete protection, particularly in women's sports, has been moving in this direction for some time. But conversations move slowly until a specific, visible, undeniable moment forces them to move faster. That moment for the WNBA played out on that sideline during a third quarter against the Las Vegas Aces. And the conversation it accelerated isn't going back to wherever it was before. Something shifted. Not everything. Sports organizations are deeply resistant to fundamental change, and the forces that create toxic environments don't disappear because one high-profile case generates bad publicity. But something shifted, and in institutions as traditionally slow-moving as professional sports leagues, shifts are worth paying attention to.
Here's what nobody in the immediate aftermath of all of this wanted to sit with too long, because it complicates the clean narrative of accountability and justice. The situation inside the Indiana Fever didn't arise in a vacuum. The tensions that built up over months and finally exploded on that sideline reflected something real about the difficulty of integrating a player of Clark's profile into an existing team structure. That's not a defense of what happened, it's an acknowledgement that the actual story is more complex than the version that fits neatly into a single viral clip. Coaching a player who generates more public attention than everyone else on your roster combined is genuinely difficult. Managing team dynamics when one person is the subject of constant external attention while others feel overlooked is a real challenge that requires genuine skill and emotional intelligence. Those challenges don't excuse what the footage showed, and they don't make the broader pattern of how Clark was managed defensible. But they're part of the complete picture, and the complete picture matters if the goal is actually learning something from what happened rather than just assigning blame and moving on. The players who built the WNBA before Clark arrived, the ones whose names were invoked passionately in the debate that erupted around this situation, have a legitimate perspective that deserves something more than dismissal. The financial transformation Clark helped accelerate didn't happen in a blank space. It happened inside a league that those players spent careers making viable, making credible, making worth watching in the first place. That history doesn't diminish Clark's impact, but it also doesn't disappear just because her impact was dramatic and commercially visible. Both things are true simultaneously, and holding both things at once is harder than picking a side and staying there. What the Indiana Fever situation ultimately exposed isn't just one coach's failure of professionalism or one organization's inability to manage its internal dynamics. It exposed the fault lines inside a league at a crossroads, between its past and its present, between the players who built it and the player who transformed its commercial profile, between the institutional instincts that kept it from growing faster and the new realities created by explosive growth. Those fault lines don't close because one incident gets resolved. They stay open and they keep demanding attention.
Stephanie White will not be remembered well in history, and that outcome was entirely of her own making. There's something almost tragic about the specifics of it. She was handed a situation that any coach in women's basketball would have considered extraordinary, a chance to lead a franchise with the most talked about player in the sport during a period of the league's greatest growth and visibility. The possibilities available to a coach who approached that situation with intelligence, empathy, and genuine strategic thinking were enormous. What she apparently chose instead was a path that ended in footage that will follow her career forever. The concept of a jealous coach, the phrase that commentators reached for repeatedly in the aftermath of the bench incident, is one of sports culture's most damning characterizations. It suggests not just a failure of strategy, but a failure of character. A coach's fundamental job is to make the players around them better. When a coach's behavior is read by players, fans, analysts, and the cameras that captured it live as motivated by personal resentment of a star's success rather than commitment to the team's performance, that coach has failed at the most basic level of the job. There's no tactical sophistication that compensates for that failure. There's no win percentage that makes the footage go away. What's genuinely interesting about the jealous coach framing, beyond its obvious application to this specific situation, is what it reveals about the psychological demands of coaching at the highest level. Being the person responsible for developing and directing talent that may be greater than your own requires a specific kind of ego management that not everyone in a leadership position has actually developed. The coaches who thrive in that situation are the ones who find genuine satisfaction in elevating someone else's greatness. The ones who can't manage it, who experience a star's success as a personal diminishment rather than a shared achievement, tend to eventually create exactly the kind of situation that played out in Indiana.
The difference between those two types of coaches isn't always visible until the pressure gets high enough. In this case, the pressure got very high, very publicly, and the result was unmistakable. The Indiana Fever will rebuild. Franchises always do eventually. Professional sports organizations have a structural resilience that comes from the simple fact that fans, TV deals, and sponsorship revenue continue to exist even when specific leaders fail spectacularly. The work of rebuilding will be harder than it needed to be, and it will start from a lower point than it could have because of choices that were made when the opportunity was at its greatest. But rebuilding will happen, and the questions around what the franchise becomes on the other side of this are genuinely interesting. For Clark, the path forward carries its own weight. She is, by any measurable standard, the most consequential player in WNBA history in terms of the league's commercial trajectory. She is also a young player who has been navigating extraordinary external pressure since before she entered the professional league. The weight of expectations, the intensity of attention, the constant analysis of every decision she makes on and off the court. The emotional honesty she showed in addressing the situation publicly, the willingness to acknowledge that it affected her, while also turning the focus outward to the league's broader interests, revealed something important about who she is beyond the basketball. What she does next, where she plays, how she plays, whether the environment around her finally reflects the respect her impact has earned, will shape the WNBA's next chapter in ways that extend far beyond her individual career statistics. The players who come after her, in a league that is now genuinely financially viable in ways it wasn't 5 years ago, will play in arenas she helped fill and earn from contracts that were made possible partly by what she built. That's a legacy that operates independently of any single night's drama, any coaching failure, any organizational dysfunction. It's already written into the financial reality of the sport. The old model, where talent could be quietly suppressed, where institutional authority was effectively unchallengeable, where a player's public influence could be managed and contained by the organization around her, showed itself to be not just morally wrong, but operationally unsustainable when applied to someone generating Clark's level of economic and cultural impact. That's the lesson, not just for Indiana, for everyone. When you trace the full arc of what happened, from the first whispers of dysfunction through the increasingly visible tensions to the bench eruption and everything that came after, what emerges is a story about the distance between how institutions present themselves and what they actually are. The Indiana Fever presented themselves as a professional organization doing the difficult work of managing a talented team in a competitive league. What they actually were, apparently, was something considerably messier and considerably less defensible. The distance between those two versions of reality is where the real story lives.
That distance is not unique to the Fever. It exists in every organization that has ever prioritized the protection of leadership over the development of talent, that has ever chosen the comfort of those in charge over the well-being of those being led. What's different about this situation is that the player being affected was operating at a level of public visibility where the distance between the institution's presentation and its reality couldn't be maintained. The cameras were always there, the fans were always watching, the analysts were always paying attention, and when the mask finally came off on that sideline, millions of people saw what was underneath simultaneously. There's a reason this story didn't stay a basketball story. It became something larger because the questions it raises about power, about accountability, about what happens when institutional authority is used to suppress rather than develop the talent it's supposed to serve, aren't questions that belong only to sports. They're questions that resonate anywhere organizations exist and anywhere the relationship between leadership and the people they're supposed to be leading goes wrong, in the specific way it went wrong here. The WNBA is different today than it was before all of this. Maybe not in every way that matters, maybe not as different as it needs to be.
But the conversation has moved, and the standard for what's acceptable has shifted, and the evidence that accountability is possible when the stakes are high enough has been demonstrated publicly in a way it can't be quietly walked back. For a league that spent years fighting for the mainstream attention it now has, that shift carries weight. The question is what gets built on top of it. And that question, what comes next, who decides, and whether the lessons of this moment actually stick, is the one worth watching, because the cameras are still rolling, and everyone knows it now.